MS Now Capitol Hill reporter Kevin Fry is outside that hearing. We are also joined by our Justice and Intelligence reporter Ken Dilanian, MS Now national security analyst Christopher O'Leary, and former D.C. Chief of Homeland Security Danelle Harvin. Kevin, let's start there on the Hill. The House has an opportunity today to follow up on yesterday's testimony from the Senate. What are they focusing on, and what are they maybe trying to get cleared up?
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of it is a repeat in terms of kind of the general themes. Obviously, there were questions, as you alluded to, about election integrity, about Tulsi Gabbard's presence in Fulton County, Georgia, when they went in to raid the voting machines there. But at the same time, a lot of attention today, again on Iran, this question of what the imminent, as has been described by the president, threat to the United States was. Here's one of those exchanges.
So is there any evidence that Iran intended to conduct a preemptive attack on the U.S. prior to beginning this war, yes or no?
Congressman, the answer to this question needs to be reserved for a closed hearing. I will say, however, the intelligence community does provide the assessments of the threats that exist to the president so that he can make that determination.
Which does echo somewhat what we heard yesterday, where Gabbard insisted that it was the president that essentially decides whether something is imminent or not. Notably, one of the follow-ups to that was from the CIA director, and he told lawmakers that in the likely event of a conflict between Iran and Israel, the U.S. would be immediately attacked. There was one other notable exchange within the last half hour or so where a Democratic lawmaker repeatedly pressed Gabbard on whether or not the U.S. and Israeli aims of this conflict are in fact aligned. Gabbard suggested they are not necessarily, and she pointed to the fact that Israel has taken aim at a lot of the leadership of Iran, whereas the U.S., she argued, has been focusing on destroying, to quote her, Iran's ballistic launching and production ability, Navy, mine-laying capability. She also would not say whether or not she believed Israel and the U.S. were in agreement over the president's push to make a deal. The list went on from there, Gabbard insisting she was not involved in the day-to-day operational planning of this conflict. Anna?
Ken, Director Gabbard has been pressed on a number of major topics, as Kevin just outlined, from these new 2020 election probes to Iran's uranium enrichment. And she doesn't often answer yes or no questions with a yes or a no. She's been kind of evasive in her answers. Is that typical of DNIs in this kind of forum?
It is not typical at all, Anna. Look, obviously, the Director of National Intelligence is a political appointee, but historically, he or she has been an intelligence official, or at least someone with experience dealing with intelligence, like Dan Coats, who is a former senator, and is willing to speak truth to power and generally has been willing to give frank assessments of what the intelligence is. I have never heard any member of the intelligence community say what Tulsi Gabbard said yesterday, which is that it's not the intelligence community's job to decide what is an imminent threat. Only the president can decide that. That is not the way this works at all. And so a lot of members, probably from both sides of the aisle, are growing ever more annoyed at the fact that she just isn't willing to answer basic questions, including what was the president briefed on in terms of the implications of the attack on Iran and what consequences would flow from that, Anna.
I want to revisit one of the moments when Gabbard was asked whether Iran posed an imminent threat before the war. This was on the Senate side. Take a listen.
The only person who can determine what is and is not an imminent threat is the president. It is not the intelligence community's responsibility to determine what is and is not an imminent threat.
Okay.
That is up to the president.
Here's the problem.
Based on a volume of information
it is precisely
that he receives.
It is precisely your responsibility to determine what constitutes a threat to the United States. This is the Worldwide Threats hearing.
Chris, we've now heard both Gabbard and Caroline Leavitt, the White House press secretary, say that only the president can determine whether a threat is imminent. Is that always how it's been with the IC? Was that the standard?
Highlighted. This is not the norm for the ODNI. I've worked in the national security community for my entire career, and this is a grand departure from what we've seen from career professionals. We have political appointees now who are doing the bidding of the president and not, really coming across as truthful or honest or forthcoming in their answers to congressional oversight, which has always been respected and acknowledged as part of the process. Going back to the preeminent strike, listen, if there was not an imminent threat, then the U.S. is really in violation of international law, which goes back to an incident in the 1800s where the U.S. was actually attacked by Britain, in Canada, the Caroline Affair it was called, and that established what an imminent threat was considered. It was actually codified in international law after World War II. So unless there was something absolutely imminent was going to happen in the next 24 hours, they had the capability and we had no other recourse, then that allows you to do a preemptive strike. Otherwise, we are violating a norm that we helped establish.
Just quickly to follow up on that, Chris, should in this forum they be able to say, yes, we assessed there was an imminent threat, or no, we did not assess there was an imminent threat?
Hired Dan.
It's very highly classified and compartmentalized. However, that's a yes or no question. So yes or no. But then if you need further details, we'll have to go in a closed session, and I'll provide you the classified information that backs up my answer.
Danelle, help us understand how officials make threat assessments and whether it makes sense to not have those members of the IC make determinations about imminence.
Well, as previously stated, that is the role of the IC. It's to collect and analyze threat intelligence from various sources, human sources, signaling sources, OSINT, open source intelligence, and to combine that into a product, either written or verbal, that can allow decision makers to make an informed understanding of the threats they face, or the over-the-horizon threats. It is clearly the role of the ODNI as a person that sits at the pinnacle of that process to pull all that information together from the various agencies and to lay that at the feet of the president and his advisors to tell them what's an imminent threat or not, based on also trend analysis. And so why this isn't, why she feels like that's not her role, I think it's politics. I think she's hedging, but it's certainly the role of the DNI, and particularly after 9/11. Let's understand how we got here. The reason why we have an intelligence community and a director of national intelligence is because the intelligence that was collected and analyzed pre-9/11 was siloed. And this is an entire enterprise that's built towards bringing all that information together, and so that we can manage the threats that we face and determine whether they're imminent or not.
Chris, yesterday, DNI Gabbard and CIA Director Ratcliffe were asked repeatedly about whether President Trump was briefed about the possibility of Iran shutting down the Strait of Hormuz should the U.S. strike. And they didn't answer directly that question either. Here's a sample.
Did the intelligence agencies stick to their assessment that in response to an attack, the Iranians had the capability to shut down the Strait of Hormuz?
Thank you, Senator Wyden. The intelligence community has continued to provide the president and his team with the intelligence related to this operation in Iran.
The president says nobody knew. And my question is, did you tell him? Anybody want to answer that question?
Senator, I'll answer the question. So with regard to briefings, the president gets briefings constantly about intelligence.
Chris, what's your response to those responses?
It's inconceivable that the president would not have been aware of the first, second, and third order of effects of going to war with Iran. First of all, the president gets the PDB, the Presidential Daily Brief, every day. And that would have included information about Iran and all of the things that would happen if we actually took offensive measures against Iran. But certainly there would have been more detailed briefs by the director of the CIA, by the ODNI, and by the Pentagon, and the rest of the intelligence community to really lay out what will happen if we go to war with them. And to say that the president and the national security advisor and the rest of the NSC were unaware is really just not I'm not able to believe that, or they're completely asleep at the wheel. There's really no other in between.
Danelle, the intel is supposed to inform or to lead the policy decisions, right? Does it appear that's how this process is working under Trump?
Well, there's a couple of different ways we can look at this, and I've been talking about this all week. Either the intelligence was solid and presented to the president and he ignored it, or wasn't presented in a way that he can consume the information, or they didn't actually produce the intelligence. Any one of those scenarios is troublesome. It's been long established that Iran has been waiting for this type of conflict for decades, whether it's boots on the ground, as we're talking about now, potentially, or bombardment or decapitation strikes. And so not to understand and have that information available to you, even in the first term, I think is concerning. If you take the president at his word and that no one really could think about this or understood that this would happen, it really gives us insights into what's happening and potential, some type of intelligence issues that are going on either on the DNI side or on the White House's side.